Now that you have a basic understanding of paganism in the Roman Empire, now it's time to understand Judaism in the time of Jesus. And the most important thing to understand about Judaism in the time of Jesus is it's not just one thing. It is not one big monolith. It is rather a bunch of different movements, different branches that all have a common theme. So Judaism in the time of Jesus, what are the elements? First of all, there is the temple. The center of Judaism in the time of Jesus is the temple, and the temple is only in Jerusalem. The temple is the place where you go for the major festivals, at least if you can, if you live in the area. So the seven great festivals of Judaism are celebrated there. In addition, it is the priests and the Levites who preside over the temple in Jerusalem. This is where sacrifices are made. This is the only place you sacrifice. You don't sacrifice out in the towns or whatever. You come to Jerusalem to sacrifice. The priestly class at the time of Jesus was socially elite, well connected in many cases with Roman authorities, and to judge from the recent excavations in the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem, quite wealthy. We've unearthed many houses where these priests lived, and they were very nice. So the temple and the priestly class were a dominant elite group in Jerusalem. And the temple and the priestly class sort of became a focal point for the Jewish people. But Judaism, as practiced on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis, for most people was not focused in the temple. It had to be near home. And this was the importance of the synagogue. Synagogue, literally the gathering place. A synagogue is not a building. A synagogue is a gathering. By definition, if you have 10 adult male Jews in your town, you have a synagogue. If you don't have 10 male Jews in your town, you don't have a synagogue. Now, if you don't have 10 adult male Jews in your town, Jews will still gather. They'll still gather on Sabbath, Shabbat. They will still have prayers, etc. But they will not technically have a synagogue. Typically, if they are gathering and they don't have a synagogue, they will gather at a place usually outside of town, usually where there is a water source because there's ritual bathing commonly involved, and they would call this place a place of prayer. The synagogue sometimes involves a building. In fact, from archaeology of the first century, we do not know of many buildings that were synagogue buildings dedicated to that worship in the first century. In fact, we only have two, probably, maybe a couple others that might be first century. One is at Masada, on top of the hill, and the other one is pictured here on this slide at Gamla in the Galilee. The synagogue is the place of gathering on Shabbat. Shabbat begins on Friday night when 3 stars are visible in the sky. It is a time of celebration, a time of worship, and of course, a time of rest. Synagogue also was a place of study, worship, the reading of Torah, etc. And other texts. Of course, we have Jesus visiting a lot of synagogues and speaking in these synagogues, sometimes reading the text, as he did in the synagogue in Nazareth, for example, where he read the text famously of Isaiah. There are, according to Josephus, 4 sects of Judaism, 4 subgroups of Jews in the time of Jesus. The first and most important, well, the 4 sects are Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. First, the Pharisees. The Pharisees are first and foremost devotees of the Torah. They believe that the most important thing that people should do is study the Bible. They do really well in SBS. They want to study the Bible and apply it to your life. That's what Pharisees are all about. What happens over time is the Pharisees develop traditions of interpretation, and some of those traditions of interpretation are, interesting. Jesus, as you probably know from reading the New Testament, Jesus, most commonly, if he's going to argue with Jewish leaders, it's going to be Pharisees. The reason Jesus argued with Pharisees is because they had the most agreement. That is, they had stuff they could really argue about. Jesus and other sects of Judaism had less agreement. But with the Pharisees, they take seriously their Bible. They take seriously the idea that one should live a life that honors God, one should live according to the Torah as revealed by God. So why is it then that they get into lots of arguments? And let me just give you a couple of examples of Pharisaic thinking, and it can help you think like them. For example, one of the commandments is you shall honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. The obvious practical question from a good student of the Bible would be, what does that mean? How do I honor the Sabbath and keep it holy? And the answer from the Bible is you shall not work. You're going to rest on that day. Now come the classic Pharisaical mentality. So, what is work? If you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, what is work? The answer? For most people, work consists of agricultural labor. So work is to plow. Work is to water. Work is to plant. Work is to harvest. Okay? So, what does that mean? How can we make sure that we're not going to break the law? That's the Pharisaic ideal. Well, the answer was, okay, if we're not going to break the law, if we want to not work, a lot of agricultural labor consists of moving water and moving dirt and bringing water and dirt into contact with each other. So we don't want to move dirt. Okay. And then the Pharisee said, okay, how much dirt? For example, what about walking on a dirt path? If you walk on a dirt path, you move dirt. So can you walk on the Sabbath? The answer was, yes, you can walk on a Sabbath, but not too much. Because if you move too much, you move too much dirt. So the question was, how much can you walk? And they ultimately came up with the solution that you can only walk 2/5 of a mile. From home, this is important. Then the obvious question was, what's home? And they said, oh, well, home is where you eat. So then some people came up with the brilliant idea that on the day before the Sabbath, what you could do is take a lunch bag and take it 2/5 of a mile from your home, and that way on the Sabbath you could walk 2/5 of a mile, eat lunch, that becomes your home, and then you could walk 2/5 more of a mile. This is starting to become a little bit silly, but you can understand the spirit of it, and you can understand the reason that they wanted to do that. Then became a really interesting question. Can you spit on the Sabbath? Because after all, spitting causes real problems, because spitting not only waters the ground, but spitting also moves dirt. Can you spit on the Sabbath? And the Pharisees ultimately decided, no, you may not spit on the Sabbath. Too much water, too much dirt, that's work. I raised this one example simply to note that the Pharisees are to be taken seriously. They're doing serious work, they're trying to apply the Bible to life. It's just that sometimes they got caught up in the details, and they got caught up in the details so much that sometimes they could just miss the point. And what Jesus' arguments commonly were with the Pharisees is, let's get back to the point. What's the point really? What are the weightier matters of the law? Justice, mercy, righteousness that tend to get forgotten in the details. In any case, this is the Pharisees. The Pharisees often were associated with people called scribes, sometimes called experts of the law, people who studied with great care these traditions. Also, Pharisees kept records of their interpretations over time, and these records accumulated and eventually came to be written down, so that becomes a body of knowledge that gets passed down, originally called oral Torah, and eventually culminating in things like the Mishnah and the Talmud. Then there are the Sadducees. The Sadducees believe, by the way, often the Sadducees are associated with the priestly class. They tend to be focused in Jerusalem. They tend to be elite socially. The most distinctive elements of the Sadducees is they only accept as sacred scripture the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. So the wisdom literature and the prophets and so on are not authoritative scripture for them. They are for the rest of Judaism, but not for the Sadducees. In addition, most of the rest of the Jewish sects believed that after death, at some point in the future, there would be a great resurrection of the righteous before God, and the Sadducees deny this resurrection. So we see this rather humorous incident in the book of Acts, for example, where Paul realizes that he's he's before a hearing of mixed Pharisees and Sadducees, and he says, I'm standing on trial because of my belief in the resurrection. Well, immediately the Pharisees will side with him and the Sadducees will side against him, and so that way he can pit them against one another, and that becomes all rather humorous. It is because of their denial of the prophets and their denial of resurrection that they got their names, because these denials obviously made these people very sad, you see. Bad joke, but I couldn't resist. The next sect of Judaism is called the Essenes. The Essenes were Jewish separatists. They believed that most Jews didn't live a holy enough life, they weren't pure enough, and so they tended to live in their own communities, away from the cities, sometimes within the cities. The most famous of them is Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were likely copied and stashed up in the caves. These Essenes had lots of ritual baths, for example, so they could maintain their high level of ritual purity and their separation from other Jews that they considered relatively polluted.